This video continues our review of reflexive verbs and their conjugation. In order to conjugate reflexive verbs, you must follow these 3 steps. Number 1, find your subject and object. 2, move and change the say to agree with your object. 3, conjugate the verb in the appropriate tense. To get started, let's take a look at how reflexive verbs are used in English. If we look at the sentence above, I wash my hands, you can see that this is a reflexive sentence. Here you can see that I am the subject and my hands are the object. So my subject and my object are the same, which by definition makes this a reflexive sentence. We can do the exact same thing with an example of reflexive verbs in Spanish. If we look at the sentence, yo de lavarse las manos, we can see that the verb lavarse is in fact a reflexive verb. So we know that our subject, yo, should be the same as our object, las manos. So we know that I, in this sentence, am washing my own hands. Again, we need to follow our 3 steps of conjugating reflexive verbs in the present tense. And our first step is to find our subject. And here, that is yo. The second half of our first step in conjugating verbs that are reflexive in the present tense is to find our object, which is receiving the action. And in this sentence, that is las manos. So we've now completed the first step. We found our subject, or the person doing the action, and then we found our object, or the person receiving the action. And again, the sentence is only reflexive because your subject and your object are the same person. So if you step back and act like you're washing your hands, do the motions, realize that you are doing the action of washing, but you are also receiving the action of washing. If you were to wash a baby's hands, or if you were to give a baby a bath, you are doing the action, but the baby is receiving the action. So that would not be an example of a reflexive sentence. The second step in conjugating reflexive verbs is to move and change the say. The say will be moved in front of a conjugated verb, and it will be changed to agree with our object. Okay, this is where it gets a little confusing. Let's look at our sentence. Yo lavarse las manos. I am washing my hands. So if they are my hands, my object is actually going to be me or myself because I am receiving the action. So we are going to move this say in front of lavar, and then we are going to change it to agree with my hands or myself. So when we move and change the say, our reflexive pronoun becomes me to agree with my hands. And that has completed our second step. Our final step is to conjugate the verb lavar. The first thing we do here is drop the AR. And that leaves us with the stem of lavar, which is LAV. So the next thing that we have to do is add our present tense ending that agrees with our subject, yo. So we know that in the present tense, the ending that agrees with yo for AR verbs is O. So we simply attach the O to the stem of lavar, and we are finished conjugating our first reflexive verb. And your sentence will read, yo me lavo las manos. And here we can see that me agrees with las manos, my hands or myself, and lavo agrees with yo, our subject. So what this tells us is that I am doing the action and I am receiving the action. Let's take a look at these 3 examples of reflexive verbs and how they are used in Spanish. If we look at the first sentence, we can see that it reads, Ella romperse el brazo. We know this is a reflexive sentence because we see our reflexive verb. This se attached to the infinitive tells us that the action of this sentence is in fact reflexive. And remember that we define reflexive as a sentence or an action where the subject and the object are the same. So even though this sentence reads, Ella romperse el brazo, she breaks the arm, we know that in Spanish, we don't refer to body parts as mine or yours. They're simply the, and in the first one, that example would be the arm. And the second one, the hair. And the third one, the teeth. But since all of these sentences are reflexive, that reflexive pronoun attached to the infinitive of all of these verbs tells us that this will be her arm, my hair, your teeth. And we get that not only from the reflexive verb, but also from knowing that in a reflexive sentence, our subject and our object are the same. So again, we'll look at that a little bit more in depth as we go through the conjugation of each verb. So the first one, ella romperse el brazo, she breaks the arm, or she breaks herself, the arm. And as we would say it in English, she breaks her arm. So again, this is just another example of why you cannot translate directly from Spanish to English as much as we would like to. Sometimes you just have to read into the context of the sentence. So, we're going to first think about our 3 rules of conjugating verbs when they are reflexive. And those 3 rules are to, number 1, find your subject and object. 2, move and change the se, or your reflexive pronoun. And remember that the se will be moved from behind the infinitive or attached to the infinitive, and it will move to in front of the conjugated verb. Again, if there are 2 verbs in a sentence, and the first verb is conjugated, and your reflexive verb is not conjugated, you will simply leave your reflexive pronoun attached to the infinitive, but you can still change it to agree with your object. And that's something that we're going to get into a little bit later. So again, let's continue with our first example. First, we're going to find our subject and our object. And in that first example, it is ella. And in the object in that first example is el brazo. So we know that ella is she, and el brazo represents the arm, or her arm, and we can also think of that as herself. And if that helps, we'll write it up here above el brazo. Okay, so we've completed step 1. We found the subject and object. The next thing we need to do is move and change the se. So we're going to take this se, and we're going to move it in front of where the conjugated verb will be. So if my subject is ella, I know that my se, to agree with ella, should be herself. So if we look at our chart up here, we know that me is myself, te is yourself, and se is herself. So we are going to choose se. And although the rules tell us that we need to move and change the se, sometimes it just won't change. And this is one of those examples. Okay, so we've completed step 2. And the third step is the easiest step for us because we have conjugated a million verbs in the present tense. So we simply have to conjugate the verb romper. So we will drop the ER, and we're left with our stem. That is R-O-M-P. And we simply have to add the ending that agrees with ella, and that is e. So our sentence now reads, ella se rompe el brazo. And you can see that a little bit more clearly here once we take all the marks away. It says, ella se rompe el brazo. All right, take a few moments now to work on the second example on your own, and then we'll conjugate it together. All right, in the second example, we're going to first find our subject and objects. And we see that yo is my subject and el pelo is my object. Remember, here el pelo is going to mean my hair or myself. So we'll put that up there just as a reminder. So we've completed step 1. Step 2, we are going to move and change the se, and remember that the se must agree with our object. So we will move this se and place it just before where our conjugated verb will be, and se will change to may, so that agrees with our subject yo and also our object of myself. The last thing that we need to do now is conjugate the verb. So, we'll drop the AR. We're left with the stem, P-E-I-N. And then we simply add the present tense AR ending that agrees with yo. And in this case, that is O. And we have now completed all 3 steps of conjugating our reflexive verb. And your second example should now read, yo me peno el pelo. Again, take a few seconds to complete your third example, and then we'll discuss that in its conjugation. All right, let's take a look at this final example. First thing we have to do is find our subject and object. Our subject here is tú, and our object is los dientes. So again, hopefully you realize that los dientes, we're not talking about just the teeth. These teeth have to be attached to someone. So if our subject is tú, our object, when reflexive, is going to be yourself or your teeth. So we've completed step 1. Step 2 requires us to move and change the se. So we'll take this se and move it again to where the conjugated verb will be. And of course that se will change in front of the conjugated verb. And we know that the reflexive pronoun that agrees with tú is te for yourself. And we've completed step 2 here. Moving on to step 3, we have to conjugate the verb. And we will drop the AR from cepillar, and we're left with our stem. And for tú, our ending is AS or as. And we have now finished all 3 steps of conjugating our third example. And your third example will now read, tú te cepillas los dientes.